Despite the imperfect artificial intelligence, I found this to be a very interesting discussion, as much of it as I could understand. You knew I was laughing because evidently my last name sounds like uncle. And so it kept coming Uncle Dude or Father Fico. I'm not a politician. But it's so encouraging to hear the discussion here, because it reminds me of the work that we began 13 years ago in Grand Rapids, Michigan, at the school that I was given. So I'm told that I'm going to give a brief introduction and then begin to entertain some questions. But I'll even incorporate in my introduction some of the things that I've heard that may advance the conversation a little bit more. If I'm speaking too fast, just put up your hand and I'll slow down a little bit. When the bishop asked me in 2012 to take over a parish, it was historically a Polish-American parish. It was built by Polish immigrants for the most part in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And these people were incredible. I did the research and learned how they started the parish, and the amount of money they raised was the equivalent of an entire year's salary at the time to build this church. The first thing that was built was the convent and the school. That was the priority. They used one area for Mass, but the priority was the school and the convent. And now, over 125 years later, I was given a parish which was falling apart. Many of the original Polish immigrants had moved out of the neighborhood. The neighborhood itself had changed considerably. And frankly, the pastoral care of the parish had been neglected seriously for about 20 years. Even the physical parish, even though it's a beautiful church, it had just decayed. When I was being shown the rectory and the school, the bishop said, "You can close the school anytime you want because it's dying, it's costing the parish a great deal of money. You know that in the United States we have no funding. Some states will have indirect assistance to schools, but in general it's completely independent," which I think, by the way, is a good idea, and we'll say that in our discussion. The school had 68 students and took about 90% of the collections that we had. So that was all of the money of the parish went to the school. There was a little bit of money for the administration of the school, and I don't think anything was spent on the upkeep of the building anyway. And I said to the bishop, let me get to know the people and see. Now I understand too that I am relating to you a story that takes place in America. So it's a different culture and different things going on, and the priorities there are different than the priorities here. But I'm going to just tell you my story. And in telling you this story, I don't want to imply that you have to do or expect anything in the way we did it. This is just the way I did it. And by the way, babies don't bother me. I tell them that in my parish all the time. Bring the babies in. It's like the angels singing. This parish had 4 masses, 3 of them with the Novus Ordo Mass, the usual Mass. Not a very inspiring Mass, just kind of like that. And then there was the old traditional Latin Mass that was held late on Sunday morning, really Sunday afternoon, to a small group of people. This was during the permission of St. John Paul II, who gave the indult to celebrate that old Mass. But that group of people were like a separate parish, a whole separate world. And frankly, many of them were not pleasant people to be around. And I think they were kind of like You know, when a dog has been beaten and neglected and you go to pet it, it bites you. I think that's what was happening. They had their own vestments, they had their own altar servers, they had their own social events, their own announcements, and they had priests who would rotate, who would come in. So basically they didn't have a pastor. They had developed their own governance and their own culture in this Mass. But it was still part of Sacred Heart Church, parish. When I took over, one of the things I said to the people at that Mass is I said, you are not God's ugly stepchildren. You are part of the church as a whole, and I want you to feel part of that. I welcome you to feel part of that. In that community, that small community, probably less than 100 people, there were a disproportionate number of families that were homeschooling their children. And when I was talking to them, I said, would you consider putting the children in the Sacred Heart School? We changed the Sacred Heart School to Sacred Heart Academy when we did this refounding of the school. And they said, only if it's Catholic. And I said, well, if it isn't Catholic, I'm closing it. I just didn't have the time to deal with it. I had never had a school before in my ministry. And so we began working, and there are a lot of little details that I could give you, but we don't have the time for that. Let me simply say that I made two decisions very quickly. It seemed to me very simple decisions, but in retrospect, they were determinative of a certain path that the school and then the parish would take. The first thing I did was I told the school that I wanted the children to attend Mass every day. Now, for some people this was a real shock, but I said, it really makes no difference. We have Mass here every day. It took a slight change in the schedule of the school, or actually it was the schedule of the Mass, of 15 minutes to incorporate the school and the teachers. The greatest resistance I got from that were from the teachers, not from the kids. And I said, this Mass will not be a children's Mass. I don't know if you have children's Masses here. It's when the children read and they sing and they do all of this kind of stuff. I said, we're not going to do that. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to help form you to be Catholics. And what I found is as I preached to them, I would be able to catechize them in addition to their curriculum. And it was a quiet Mass. This is going to be very important later on, and I want to mention this to you, that quiet, silence is very important, especially for children. Because one of the greatest problems we have today is children who are inattentive, who cannot maintain attention. They have short attention spans. And I think a lot of that has to do with this. So that if they're not being entertained constantly and they're bored, they look for something to distract themselves. I think it is a good thing that children learn how to deal with boredom. I have to deal with boredom when I'm reading a thick book with words I may not understand or concepts that I find difficult. But the way I get through that book is by having built up a tolerance for being bored. Especially for children, that's when their imagination can come into play, precisely when they're bored. And what I've found now over 13 years in that parish, if you go to that Mass, this is now that the original number of the students when I took it over was 68 students. There are now 400 students in that school. Their parents who drop them off for school very often attend with them, and all of the teachers. So we have about 500, maybe 600 people at a daily Mass. And if you come to that Mass with all of these children, which is why I hope you translated for the lady with the baby, don't leave. I like to hear the baby, keeps me going. you would not hear distractions. There's not little fights going on in the pew. The children are there. And sometimes you can see they're dozing off, and other times I'm amazed at how attentive they are. So that was the first thing I did, Mass every day for the children. And then when we're at Mass, I began to chant the Our Father in Latin for them. Now at first, they didn't know, but pretty soon, after 2 or 3 months, they began to pick it up. Children are wonderful. They're sponges, especially at that age. It's easier for them than it is for us. And then what happened with that is the children would go home and the parents would hear them chanting the Our Father in Latin. And this was what's going on in the school. The second thing I did, we had some teachers from the public school that were given to us by the state of Michigan. This is a unique arrangement in the state of Michigan, where we could have teachers who taught in our school. We'd rent them the classroom. So it was really, the classroom was operated by the state of Michigan, but they were in the school. It saved us money because we didn't have to pay for 3 teachers and all of the insurance and everything else that went with that. The problem with it was that the pastor had no say over who would be teaching. And the second thing was that they required, the state of Michigan required that we remove all religious symbols from the classroom. So when I came in the classroom and I was going through the school the first time, I looked and I saw there was no crucifix. And I opened the closet door and I found the statue of the Blessed Mother in the closet. And I calmly, after that, notified the state of Michigan that we would not require the assistance of those 3 teachers. Now, a lot of the people in the school said, well, where are you going to get the money to fill those things? And I said, we'll figure that out. By the way, this is one thing I've learned from having started a number of organizations, another number of institutes. I don't worry about the money at first. I'm not saying you should be impractical, but the most important thing isn't the money. The most important thing is the vision. And if you can construct a cohesive vision that inspires people and that people believe in, the money will find you. I promise you that. And I have built now 3 organizations that are multi-million-dollar organizations now, given to us not from any government subsidy, but just the generosity of people. Again, I know there's a different culture, and that American culture is different with regard to philanthropy. But again, I'm just telling you the way it worked for me. So we began. Now, the truth is, this was the first time I'd ever had a school, and I knew next to nothing about what we have been talking about these days. I'd heard of classical education, and I thought of it mainly as a great books program. So I thought, well, so we're just reading classic texts instead of the modern texts. But I was fortunate that in my congregation there was a man who wasn't involved in anything prior to my coming, who came up to me and said, I can see that you want this school to be a serious Catholic school. I said, yes. He said, I used to run a classical academy in the state of Colorado, and I would be very happy to help you. And so he did. And that began my education about what a classical, perennial Catholic education is. Let me say what it is. Now, I find myself fearful in presenting to you an unattainable ideal that you will think, well, this is wonderful in some other world, probably not on earth. And it might seem difficult to imagine that this could be possible. But I'm not talking about method. I'm not talking about selling you a product which has different elements in it, and if you put in the right recipe, it will come out the way you want it. I'm talking to you about the building of a culture. And I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I imagine that Slovak children, very much like American children, in interfacing with the technology and friends outside of the faith, very often pick up music, language, a whole aesthetic. They pick up lifestyles and ideas, drugs and promiscuity, many destructive elements, and they're drawn to it. And when you try to resist it, they resist you. I know many parents are afraid to take away their telephones or their screens from their children. I've seen things of a boy destroying his home because his mother took away his iPad for a weekend because of whatever reason she was punishing him. But what they are drawn to is a culture. A culture has been put in place that has its language, that gives an identity, that plays to certain themes that attract. I'm suggesting that what we need to do is be very deliberate and equally as committed to building a counterculture to that culture that will draw those young people and us, because we have to be involved in this. This isn't something we're just doing for kids. This requires the commitment of families. It requires the commitment, the clear commitment of teachers. It requires the clear commitment of pastors. And if you can't have these elements, it's going to be very difficult to be a little bit this way and a little bit that way. And it doesn't have to be big at first. It can be very small, because the culture of life replenishes itself. There's a logic to life that gives life. And when you see, even if it's just a few families living that way, people look at them and say, I'd like my family to be like that. And if we have a group of people in a parish, and a pastor who will lead them, and maybe some teachers and sisters, in particular sisters, the importance of the witness of the consecrated life in this whole mix is part of the culture. It begins to grow. This group that we started with, remember, we're 68 students that were not at all involved in a classical approach to education. In many respects, they were very much like the public school school system. I went to a talent show that we had once, right at the beginning, and I was appalled at the songs I heard them singing, with all kinds of sexual references. And then they had a social event for the kids in the 7th grade, and it was in our gymnasium. And they dimmed the lights, and they had a crystal ball with colored lights, just like a bar. And the girls were dressed in very slinky clothes, and the boys were on the other side, and they didn't interact with one another, and there was this blaring music, and I realized nobody was having fun. The next year, we ended up having, this is maybe is a very American thing, but we ended up having a square dance. Do you notice square dances? It's usually a Western thing. And I said, this is for the 7th graders, but we're inviting their whole family. And we had a barn full of people, and everyone had fun. And it was wholesome, and it was respectful. And this was the building of a culture. There's so many other details to this to indicate how it can be shifted. And then, but you have to know, you have to have a few radicals who will begin to tilt the culture. And the wonderful thing about Slovakia is this place. I come here and I feel right at home. If parishioners of mine came here and were at this conference today, they would feel right at home with you, because the culture that we're talking about is the perennial Catholic culture. And that's what makes it possible. So we began that way. It took about 3 years for the thing to really begin to build momentum. And then it kept going. And I remember this was our school, was kindergarten to 7th grade. And then the parents said, we want to start a high school because now our kids are going on and we want them to continue with this kind of learning. And I said, I don't think the bishop will let us have a high school. I said, he has 2 high schools in the diocese and he wouldn't want the competition. And they came back the next year and said, we're having a high school. So I went to the bishop with the proposal, and I was surprised that he was very open to it. And he let us do it. And to show you the contrast, the bishop who let us do it didn't fully understand what we were doing. Because he came to that high school in the first year of its existence. The class was taught by a retired federal judge, and the class for this particular class was government. And so he came in and he said, hello, boys and girls. This is a government class? And they said, yes. He said, can you tell me who the senator representing Michigan is? Who is the federal senator? With silence. And he said, well, who is the attorney general of the state of Michigan? Silence. He said, who's the congressperson from this district? Silence. And the bishop turned and looked at me and the judge and said, this is a government class? And we looked at each other, and I was trying to think what to say, and a boy stood up, who, by the way, is about to be ordained in a few weeks to the priesthood. He stood up and he said, Your Excellency, right now we're studying Aristotle. We'll get to all of that stuff later. That was the cultural shift, I think, in the mind of the bishop, who has then let us continue to do this. This was a very countercultural thing in our diocese. Some of the priests were very critical of it. Especially they were critical when people from the other parishes began coming. And they thought, well, we're stealing their students. It ended up we could prove that we weren't stealing their students because a lot of those students never went to Catholic school. They were either homeschooled or they went to other schools. So this momentum continued to build. And then COVID hit. And the schools were closed down. We resisted that as long as we could until the bishop made a very clear order, and then we obeyed that. But the first thing we did was give lessons for the kids to go home with and arrange for Zoom conversations with the kids. And then as COVID developed and then as it began to fade, we were the first to open. We were, by the way, the first to close a day before the state of Michigan and the Catholic schools because I wasn't sure what was going on. I wanted to be sure that we were safe. And then we were the first to open. And the Secretary of Education of the United States came to our school to visit us because she couldn't find any open schools to visit. And she wanted to encourage the opening of the schools. In that year of COVID, we added 120 families in 1 year to the school, which brought us up to about the 400 that we have now. We're at capacity. We can't do any more. Again, I want to end, the challenge of this thing is that it is a whole. It's not pieces. And if we just talk about curriculum, we're not talking about enough. The culture will build the momentum. I was sitting at a gathering. We had a seminarian visiting that our group of the Knights of Columbus, a men's group, was supporting. And the seminarian came and we took him out to a pub. And there must have been about 20 men around talking. And I listened to one man talking to another man, one father talking to another father. And he said, do you know that family so-and-so? And he said, yeah, I know them. He said, you know, I've seen him interact with his son. And I want to be a father like that to my son. And I realized immediately that the formation that was going on wasn't just formation that I had to direct. All I had to do was orchestrate a culture and then the culture would build on the culture. And that's what we have now. And by the way, now there are several other schools in the state of Michigan that are beginning classical education. So I hope that touches some of the issues that you've raised, but I wanted to relate to you this story and really tell you that I am still learning about all of this. And just leave you with one thought. Michelangelo and Bramante built St. Peter's Basilica, but they never saw it. They designed it, they believed in the design, but they never saw it. It was 104, 120 years after the death of Michelangelo that you could see the basilica itself. That's what you're doing here and now. Don't expect to see this thing in full fruition, not even after this campus is built. Martin, you will see it from purgatory. No, come to think of it, Martin. That was not ex cathedra. Come to think of it, Martin, I think you will see it from heaven, because if you get it built, that will be your purgatory. So I'll leave it there and open it up for questions.